All right, this is where I left off the last time. So, when California wants to become a state, they want to enter as a free state. Let's remember that the Mexicans who had lived in California and the Spanish before them, none of these people had ever wanted anything to do with slavery. And most of the people who were moving to California to take part in the gold rush were not the types that were going to be bringing slaves with them. If you're a moderately successful farmer or plantation owner in the South, successful enough to own slaves, you wouldn't be the kind to just chuck that all and sell your land and move to California to gamble on the fact that you might find gold. Because you have a successful income where you are in the South, especially if you're a wealthy plantation owner. So mostly the people who were going to California for the gold rush that boosted the population so that it could enter as a state were not slave owning people and didn't have that mentality. Now, I'm not saying there were no slave owners or no slaves. I'm just saying that they were not very numerous. So California wants to enter as a free state. And that's going to upset the balance of slave and free states, and that concerns the Southerners in the Senate. And also there's increasing abolition in the North and increasing help for runaway slaves. And so the Southerners are starting to make noises about secession yet again. And so our man Henry Clay is on the job. Henry Clay of Kentucky. I try to throw Kentucky in there whenever I can because I'm from Kentucky. So if there's a Kentucky reference to be made, I always try to make one. All right. So Henry Clay offers up the Compromise of 1850. Notice I have these bullet points in red because you have to know the points of the Compromise of 1850. It's very important. All right. The Compromise of 1850 offers that 1, California will be allowed to enter as a free state. 2, there are no limits on slavery in any of the territories. That means that any of the territories can have slaves. All right. So let's stop talking about the Wilmot Proviso. Done. 3, the slave trade would be illegal in Washington, D.C. In other words, we can't buy and sell there. Now, obviously, we can't import slaves because that's been over since 1808. And honestly, it really did kind of shut down after that date. But slavery itself can be there in Washington, D.C., but you cannot buy and sell. You cannot trade slaves in Washington, D.C. But I want you to look at the last bullet point because it is the most important. The Compromise of 1850 includes something called the Fugitive Slave Act, which makes it illegal for anyone to help runaway slaves, to hide them, to transport them, to help them in any way. And it makes it almost so in the North, you are required to help return these slaves, period. So now if you are Farmer Brown in Pennsylvania, who is used to helping these runaways, now you can get thrown in jail or fined for it. This wasn't always followed through on, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so Northerners who were abolitionists, this drove them insane, completely crazy, this Fugitive Slave Act. But even people who were sort of on the fence found this to be objectionable because they're like, well, once this person leaves Southern land, they should be able to be free. Because if you notice my little headline up at the top, this allowed slave hunters from the South to come into the northern cities and hunt people down. And sometimes even they would take people who were not slaves. If you couldn't prove that you were a freeborn African American, you might likely be shipped back to the South as a slave, even though you were not one. It happened to people. All right. However, Thoreau, in his essay, Civil Disobedience, Thoreau encouraged people to disobey this law, and they did. Juries would refuse to convict people who had been found guilty of harboring slaves, or judges would refuse to hand down much of a fine or prison time for someone who had been guilty of helping a slave. So even though this Fugitive Slave Act was enacted and it was the law, locally people were starting to rebel against it and would follow it to the very most minimal amount that they would have to follow it. All right. Stephen Douglas is cut off up here in this frame up here at the top, but you need to be able to put Senator Stephen Douglas together with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. All right, this bill in 1854, now we're 6 years out from the Civil War. Douglas is not happy with any of the provisions that have been offered previous to this. And so, especially, he wants to be able to have slavery brought into the area of Kansas and Nebraska, and that's a much larger area than what is just the states of Kansas and Nebraska today. And he wants to organize all of this land west of Missouri, the state of Missouri and Iowa. Those two states are already there, into two big territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Now, both of those territories are north of the line that should have divided slavery. And this plan is going to allow people to vote on slavery as they move into the territories and those areas are made into states. And even as they are territories, the people who go there with their governments will be able to vote on slavery. So, in other words, if I'm moving into Nebraska territory and we're all moving there, now we don't get our own government right away. We have a territorial governor appointed for us, but we do have local government people. But we get to vote on whether or not to have slavery in our territory of Nebraska. This is called popular sovereignty. Douglas tagged it with this to make it sound good, because popular sovereignty is good because we vote on things in this country, and that's what we're doing. We're voting on slavery. I went into this a little more detail in class, but you need to understand that Stephen Douglas had ulterior motives here. It wasn't just because he thought that slavery should be legal because it was constitutional. He had land holdings, and he wanted the Transcontinental Railroad to go through his land because they paid high prices for land. And there were reasons that he wanted this land developed quickly because he wanted the Transcontinental Railroad to go through it. So, and I explained it more fully in class. I don't want to take a whole lot of time here because it's a side story and you'll never be tested on it. But it does make it seem a little more sensible why he was in such a hurry for this. All right, Northerners don't like this thing a bit because it would allow slavery in areas that were designated for free for decades, because we're talking about areas that were part of the Louisiana Purchase territory that had been designated free for a long time. Southerners love it because they expected Kansas would be settled by slaveholding people from Missouri. If you look at the map, let's see here. Here's Missouri. Here's Kansas territory. They expect slaveholding people from Missouri to flood into here with their slaves. Okay. And the bill passes without the backing of President Pierce in 1854. And it ends up causing a mini civil war for 6 years in advance of the actual Civil War in Kansas. All right, this thing is called Bleeding Kansas. Supporters from both sides rushed into Kansas hoping to influence the voting on slavery. Slavery supporters were known as border ruffians. That's a vocab term you need to know. They crossed illegally from Missouri into Kansas and voted in the election, and then they go back home. When the election took place, the actual election and voting on slavery, really only about 1,500 voters lived in Kansas, because remember, it's a territory. It's not a state yet. But 6,000 votes were cast. Now, you know there's something really wrong there. But of course, we're back in the days. It's hard enough now with voter fraud. People can't track it down even now most of the time. But back in those days, you can't track it down at all. Anti-slavery people refused to accept this vote, and they also refused to accept the validity of the government that comes from it. So you're going to have a bad time of it here in Kansas pretty shortly. So by January 1856, Kansas has two rival governments. One of them is a pro-slavery government, and one of them is an anti-slavery government, and they're both existing in the same place at the same time. Well, not exactly the same place, but in the same territory. All right, so Lawrence, Kansas is a little city where the anti-slavery people were sort of living, most of them, and most of the government people were. In May of 1856, pro-slavery supporters attacked this little town of Lawrence. It's called the Sacking of Lawrence. That won't be tested, just trying to give you some background. And they burned this little town to the ground. They burned out people's homes. They burned people's crops, killed off their livestock. The pro-slavery people did this to the anti-slavery government people and the anti-slavery families that lived there. Okay, so John Brown, you see his picture up there. All right, John Brown was a crazy abolitionist, and he was not going to let this stand. He said, well, me and my anti-slavery abolitionist friends are going to go in there to Kansas and we will take care of business. And he did. He led an attack on the pro-slavery people and he killed 5 of them. And this started the Civil War in Kansas, and it went on for several years, and it's called Bleeding Kansas. That's what the newspapers of the day called it. And the reason I'm making a big deal about it is because it is it's like the forerunner of the Civil War. It's like when you have an earthquake, sometimes there are There are precursor shocks. There are shocks that happen ahead of it. This what this is. It was exactly what was going on.